Good morning, everybody. You join us here at a special Q&A session with DVSA today, where we're going to be grilling them slightly on some of the developments in the past 24 hours, asking some of the questions that you folks have kindly sent to our respective associations. Just to introduce you to our Celebrity Squares people here today, you've got myself, Carly Brookfield, Chief Executive of DIA. We've got Peter Harvey from MSA. We've got Lynn Barry from ADA and JC. We're also joined by Mark McGee and Mike Warner from DVSA, both probably familiar faces to everybody by now. Morning, folks.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Afternoon.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to kick straight off into the questions now that we've compiled over the last 24 hours. I'm going to start with, actually, strangely, focusing on the Transport Committee that Gareth Llewellyn appeared at the other day. Gareth was very fulsome in his praise in that committee of the staff across the agency. But does he think the comms process for this particular crisis has been good enough during this pandemic? Over to you.
I'll pick that one up because it's about comms. So I'll pick that one up. I can't speak for Gareth, obviously, but obviously I've watched the Transport Select Committee recording. I think Gareth did speak quite eloquently, emphasising the point that, you know, between decisions being made, comms being written, comms being cleared, comms going out, there has been a significant gap between those things. We're aware of that. Obviously, we're not entirely happy with that, and we're obviously working to review that, and there are lessons that we need to take on board with it. I think all I would highlight is the fact that obviously the decision making then needs to be written up into communications that's easy to read, quick, short, simple, to the point, not going into all of the detail that the decision makers obviously considered in the course of making the decision. That comms is written, it's then submitted through a long chain. It has to go through DFT, it goes to number 10, it goes to cabinet, it then comes back again. So yeah, there's a lot to consider in that comms. Is it as quick as we want it to be? No, it's not, honestly. Sincerely apologise to everyone on the call for that. But what we do like to think is that when the comms does go out, it is correct, it is accurate, and it's the information that we need to get out. So yeah, there are lessons to learn.
So you've used addressed my next question about why is it taking comms so long to come out. One of the comments from people is, surely once the tiers were announced as a strategy, not in their detail, we're talking about as a next step strategy, 4 weeks earlier, comms should have been, on ice earlier, or decisions should have started to be made in a contingency manner by DVSA that could have made some of these decisions, some of these comms easier to do and quicker.
You give us far too much credit in terms of the level of decision making that we have. It's lovely that you think that about us. I suppose, firstly, it's a fair point. I suppose the answer to the question ultimately is, do you want a quick and easy answer, or do you want the right answer, even though it might take a bit longer? Now, to put that in context, getting the right answer, we think we've got the right answer now in terms of being able to deliver tests and lessons in tier 3 areas. Let's be honest, may not always have been that decision. There's been a lot of conversations going on behind the scenes and a mammoth effort from DVSA and other departments. There's been a lot of collaboration between DVSA to emphasise the SOPs we have in place, the mitigation measures we have in place, why we feel it's safe to operate as we've suggested. We've had to have those conversations with Public Health England. We've had to demonstrate that to ministers that it's safe for us to operate the way we have at 5 tests per day, which is what we did on the original lockdown back in March, April, May. That's taken time to demonstrate, it's taken time to evidence, but ultimately it's the right decision, and we got to that point. It did take a lot of time, and literally the decision only came through at 7 a.m. yesterday morning. So it's been a long time to get to that point, but if I say it wasn't always that way, it's taken a lot of collaboration for us to get to this point. Ultimately, it's the decision that certainly I hope you will be happy about. Certainly we are, from an operations point of view. We obviously recognise the huge backlog that we've still got yet to clear, and the real people that are waiting for those tests, and obviously the economic impact in terms of, people need a driving licence in order to be able to access employment opportunities. So we've emphasised all of that, but ultimately it comes back to the public health conversation. Is it safe for us to do those tests? And that's taken a lot of conversation, collaboration and debate internally within multiple government departments to be able for us to be in the position we're in today. So yes, it's taken time, I respect that, but it's the right decision that we got out in the end.
Okay. For balance, I would say that overall, we all acknowledge there are some needs to make fixes in the communications process for the future. And that's across all government, not just DVSA, DFT. And I know you've taken that on board personally in the comms team. But the other bit of balance that I'd give to it is that you're not as a freer position to say this as perhaps I am, given that your stakeholder and bosses at DFT might not like it. But I will say that I am aware that your teams did fight, particularly in operations teams, very hard to make sure that testing could resume and training in all areas. And you're very right. If we'd have had a quicker answer, it wouldn't have been an answer that people would have liked. They might have not been able to go out to do training. Whereas this debating up to the last moment and making representations to the last moment meant a more positive result that testing could take place in all tiers. So we do have to give some credit to those teams that fought so hard against quite a bit of opposition from health officials to actually have training and testing happen across the board from today.
Carly, I think obviously those discussions, as Mike alluded to with Public Health England, are crucial to this. But obviously, I suppose the other key point is that let's not overlook that we are just one cog in a much bigger wheel of everything across government and across the UK, which has to be considered as to what is safe to go ahead and what isn't. So although we would all like to be in the front of the queue, obviously we have done some contingency planning. We have an idea of what we might be able to deliver, but obviously until those discussions play out, we don't have the final answer. And what we were keen to avoid was obviously the situation we found ourselves in at the start of the last national restrictions that have just ended, where obviously we had a direction about one thing, and when the regulations were published, they didn't quite say the same thing. So obviously a lot of discussions gone on behind the scenes to make sure that we have some clarity so that we can get some comms out, get the message right, and that hopefully people have that clear message as to now where we are now.
Great, thanks for that. Lynn, I'm going to throw over to you for the next couple of questions.
Okay, thanks, Carly. Yeah, I'd like to just ask how instructors are expected to be able to manage their diary and their business when we had such short notice yesterday. You know, I'm an ADI myself. I know how desperate instructors were feeling. How are we supposed to manage? I mean, how can we get this better?
Again, I think it's a comms question, so I'll pick it up and Mark will jump in. But with great difficulty, I'm not going to sit here and say everything's rosy, because it certainly isn't. I do respect that you had hours notice. I think that the slots were made available around 2 o'clock. Comms went out about 4:30. So and obviously I saw your post as well from ADI, NJC and DIA advising those slots were available beforehand, because obviously they've been picked up within the community that those have been made available on the booking system. I suppose from our point of view, we wanted to get the ops position in place and then get the comms out so that the slots were there and waiting when the comms actually did go out. In terms of managing your calendar, yeah, it is extremely difficult, and I fully empathise and respect that. In terms of candidates being ready, again, I think that's a matter for the individual candidates, if they've been able to do private practice or not, and if they're in a position to be able to take that test. That's really for them to make that decision, which is why we didn't invite people in to book their tests, as in people who'd had their test cancelled on the 2nd. We didn't directly rebook them in, because if we did that and they weren't ready, they would have effectively lost that test, and the slot they were in may well be more favourable than what they would have if they failed the test. So we didn't move people in that way. But in terms of managing your calendar, I do apologise.
Would it not have been possible just to tell us what date we were going back, considering that the hairdressers, tattoo artists, all these sorts of people knew ages ago? It just seems to me that driving instructors are just not, put in any sort of category here. If we'd just known the date, yet alone all the other bits, that would have helped some time ago.
Lynn, I think there was, if you look back on to government communications from early November, I think there was some confusion about whether or not it was the 2nd or 3rd of December, and I think different articles referred to different dates. And to be honest, we've only just had that clarity ourselves. Again, explaining the previous answers, obviously as part of those discussions, some clarity around whether or not it was the 2nd or 3rd of December. So even we did not have that until very recently. So obviously we can only respond to what we find out, and as Mike says, we then have to go through that process. Obviously we have to stand up examiners. Obviously we need to get permission from the ministers and across government to do all of that, and all of that has unfortunately taken time, which obviously fully respective of the position it leaves you in and candidates. I know you will probably ask, so I believe we have 1,200 tests booked for today, given not a large number in comparison to what might have been available, but obviously I suppose anything that eats into that backlog has to be taken as a plus. Like you, I do just hope that there are people who feel ready for the test and that they're not taking it because they feel obliged to.
Yeah, I mean, that leads into the next question, really. In terms of road safety, why aren't ADIs allowed to go back to work, say, 2 weeks before the test can resume? We seem to always be going back together. Why can't we just say that the training needs to happen before the testing starts, and then we could get back to work in future?
I think the difficulty that we had this time around, I think if you remember previously, we always discussed that training should resume ahead of testing so that candidates can get some training in and be better prepared. I think given obviously the current national restrictions that have just ended were implemented to protect the NHS and save lives, but obviously they were for a set period. So therefore it was more difficult to allow training to resume ahead of testing. Even meant you would have had to allow to do training during the national restrictions where obviously this wasn't allowed, or alternatively we end up with a 2-week hiatus where we wouldn't actually be conducting any tests for 1 or 2 weeks further than what we are. So again, we was in a difficult position, but we are fully reflective of, as we just said, of the position on instructors.
Yeah, because it concerns me we might get more lockdowns. I mean, from what people are saying, we might get one in January. So this may not be
again, we'll be doing contingency planning. I think we will hope that obviously now we're into tiers. They're going to be reviewed every 2 weeks. Obviously, those who are in tier 3 at the moment, obviously, may move into tier 2, which means obviously we can increase capacity in those areas. I think we all wait to see what happens after Christmas, given obviously the 5 days of freedom. People will hopefully be sensible. Again, our aim would be to avoid having to go into a national lockdown, certainly not to close down the booking system, because obviously we've learnt lessons there, but obviously we can only ever react to what gets announced by government, but it won't be for the want of doing contingency and preparing. Now we've got an idea as who's in what tier. We've been through a short, sharp 4 weeks. We've been through it with Wales. Obviously in Scotland, if something falls into tier 4, we close. So obviously we are seeing it, but obviously don't forget we've got vaccination hopefully starting to roll out soon. Hopefully other measures will be coming along. So hopefully we will all see the light at the end of the tunnel by the spring or by Easter, obviously. But obviously we can only work towards what we know.
Yeah, that's one piece of good news in all this from today, isn't it?
Lindsay, would you mind if I just jump in there? Mark, since you're talking about tiers, could you clear up for us whether instructors in England are going to be allowed to move within tiers, like from tier 1 to tier 2, tier 2 to tier 3, etc.? There seems to be a lot of confusion about that just now.
My understanding of that is that is allowed. Obviously, Peter, you would know up in Scotland that obviously somebody who lives or operates in tier 4, they're not allowed to travel out to operate. Obviously, that is in legislation, and obviously, therefore, that is forbidden. But in England, I think it's more advisory. Obviously, the recommendation is that you do not. It's about minimising travel, but I do not believe that the regulations stipulate that you can't do that. Obviously, intention is still that people can travel to work if they cannot work from home. Obviously, I think the suggestion is obviously if you're going from tier 3 into tier 2, you should still follow the rules that are in your tier in which you live in tier 3. But obviously, it's not saying you cannot, but anybody who has, then please be sensible about it.
Okay, so
just want to reverse well. One of the things that Mark did refer to is the tiers, and obviously if tiers do change, there's 2 aspects of that. If a tier does change into tier 3, obviously then new restrictions will be put in place. So obviously we need to be aware that some tests would ultimately be cancelled if they do get moved into a higher. If you're in a tier 2 and get upgraded, the reverse is also true. Obviously, if you're in tier 3, being downgraded to tier 2, then additional capacity would then be made available. So this goes back to the conversation that I had with Carly on the DIA webinar, where we talked about candidates being ready and being able to move and grab a slot when those become available. So undoubtedly they will become available. available. You know, as we get control of the virus, areas will start downgrading from tier 3 to a tier 2 in line with public health guidance. Obviously, when that happens, new slots will be put on there and made available. So this comes back to that point of candidates being ready to grab a slot if they are test ready.
Okay, thank you. How is it that the DfT have ruled it not safe on road safety grounds to extend the theory certificates? We've constantly debated that with you and asked you about it, but then it's okay for pupils to go for a test with no period refresher training. So these tests were allowed today. How is that? To me, it just doesn't compare.
No, I think it's obviously what Mike said there. Obviously, I think the assumption is, I mentioned 1,200 tests have been taken up. I think the hope is that those people would have been having some private practice during national restrictions, which obviously even that was quite restrictive. They couldn't only have that if it was for a member of their household. So I am hoping that those 1,200 people have had some of that driving experience in the last few weeks. The decision is obviously just around trying to manage the backlog, which obviously I know we're all concerned about. You are as equally as what we are, but I do understand your concerns about road safety is the priority. I know, obviously, I know that obviously had a number of parliamentary questions since the decision was made not to extend the validity of the theory test certificates, and obviously the minister has obviously had quite a lot of correspondence about that. But up to now, the decision is that we maintain the stance that road safety is important. It's important that particularly that new drivers, when they first drive on their own for the first time, have that skills and HPT ability that obviously you all help them to gain, not just through their training, but also during their lessons.
I think it's a safety.
Sorry, Carly, I think it was all about road safety more from my perspective, because the private practice was meant to be limited. I mean, they were only supposed to be going on essential journeys, such as to the
yes, it was, yes,
and not deviating from the route. So they weren't supposed to be out there with private practice. So personally, I find giving them tests today, I was shocked by that. Sorry,
if I can, Carly, do you want to jump in or shall I jump in?
I think my comment was going to be, yes, the road safety question is really, really important, and I would really like to trust that the decision was made, not from DVSA's point of view, but the minister's asking DVSA to open up on the 2nd was not a PR job to be able to say, we've been able to open one day early. And I don't expect you to answer that. That's just
Thank you.
There's not been any PR about it.
No.
There's not been any big push of aren't we great?
And I won't fall over dead if somebody celebrates a success in some form at some point.
Yeah, obviously we can't criticise the decision.
No,
it wasn't our decision.
The second point I would make is road safety is incredibly so much the priority in this question about theory tests. But I would also say the consumer argument is there as well, that they've paid for a service, and expectation that they'll be able to use that certification, and many customers are not able to use that product now, so it's not fit for purpose in that respect. So I think if that argument isn't already been considered in terms of the minister looking again at theory test certificates, I would use the consumer argument very strongly as an agency that is not supposed to put an undue financial burden on the end user. Just to take one back. Not for you to answer now.
I do just want to pick a couple of points though. So one of the points, Lynn, you raised is around road safety and around candidates going for a test today. DVSA hasn't booked those tests. We didn't move anyone into that test and tell them that they had to do that test there and then. In terms of the candidate, our view as DVSA is it's not our place to cancel a test that's not included within a lockdown. That's for the candidate to make that decision. If they're ready to take a test, then those slots were available. And obviously, if in discussion with their ADI, they could grab one of those slots and go for that test. That's really their decision. It's not us compelling that. Likewise, we've also said that they are able to reschedule their test. Although I know you're going to come back and say, well, reschedule their test to February, March next year.
April.
But what options do we have? You know, we're dealing with an international pandemic. there's only so much we can do. As you know, we're redeploying warrant card holders to provide additional capacity. We're doing overtime. We're operating on Saturdays. We're doing everything we can to make additional slots available from a very finite resource. But in terms of road safety, we're effectively saying that back to the candidate. It's for the candidate to determine, are they ready for test? And the fact that we've now opened up on today, obviously people can now go for lessons today in readiness for tomorrow. Thankfully, obviously, I'm aware that that communication only came out at 4:30 yesterday. I appreciate it didn't give people much time, but they now can go out, do lessons in preparation for tomorrow. The candidates today, the 1,200, as Marcus said, I would hope they discussed it with their ADI, assessed their own readiness for test, and then decided whether or not to go for those slots. But that's for the candidate to determine, not for us.
Well, exactly. It's for the candidate to determine with their ADI, and those are really difficult discussions with pupils because they are so desperate. And when they hear April, it doesn't help. But, yeah, thank you. Peter, I think.
Thank you, Lynn. Just to follow up on what you just said there, the trouble is that most pupils who decide they're going to take a test today will decide they're going to take the test today anyway, no matter what. It won't matter what the instructor says if they think they're going to not get a test until April, and some of them will turn up in their own car. Anyway, that's not what I was about to ask you about. I was interested when you said that the road safety angle on not extending the theory test. I don't expect you to answer this, but it seems to me that extending the MOT certificates for 6 or 9 months would probably create a lot more road safety issues than extending someone's theory test certificate. But nevertheless, bear in mind where we are now.
Peter, just to answer that one, the legislative position was slightly different, that the MOT legislation does actually allow extensions, so it's easier to deliver. We're obviously in theory to do a regulatory change to extend the validity of the theory test, then normally we would go through the consultation process and all of that goes with it.
Hopefully this pandemic doesn't last much longer, but who knows what will happen in the future. Maybe we should be considering that just now for the future. It's a future policy.
Again, just I suppose in terms of that, we need to look at the broader picture of what other legislation is out there at the moment in Parliament, and in terms of obviously the theory test certificate might be a priority for us, for example, or for certain people, but obviously it's just again one of a number of things that is vying for parliamentary space at the moment. So therefore, obviously, in terms of the opportunity to get that regulatory change, it's not always as straightforward as we would like. But obviously, I think the message has been received loud and clear, not just today, but obviously through the minister's post bag. But obviously, it was a decision that was obviously made by government.
Thank you. My next point, I realise that you both apologise for the lack of communication, but it does seem to us that instructors have suffered really badly because of the late decision of last night. Are DVSA considering offering some sort of compensation to instructors who have obviously lost work today in England because they couldn't get out to work, didn't have enough notice, wouldn't have been able to put people in that particular position?
The short answer is no. I think, as I explained, obviously we only had clarity very recently, and obviously we are aware that some trainers did actually obviously decide that they were going to work today even before we was able to confirm whether or not it was resuming. I know that one particular driving school had been advertising they were resuming today. So again, obviously, whether or not that was taking a flyer, whether or not it was the right or wrong thing to do, but I don't think it is for the agency is not in a position to be able to financially compensate trainers on basis on the decision that we wasn't able to make or announce until yesterday.
And we're not unique in that position. If you look on BBC News yesterday evening, there was an article about a restaurant that was basically saying exactly the same thing, that they weren't aware they could reopen on the 2nd, and they're not able to recoup that cost. So again, it's not unique to DVSA, this question about can we open on the 2nd or not, or is it the 3rd, or what time does it come to an end? That's a question for a lot of different sectors. It's not unique to DVSA.
Peter, maybe I should ask this question now because it kind of dovetails with what you've just asked in terms of financial losses. Will DVSA continue to refund test fees on short notice cancellation and across all the categories? And will there be clear communications about how that's going to happen? Because, you know, refunding costs is important to people being able to re-establish their financial ability.
Yeah, the position hasn't changed. Obviously, if a candidate is unable to come for their test because obviously displaying COVID symptoms, and it's far more important that they stay at home, and that equally applies to our examiners. So obviously we will continue to obviously reschedule tests at no cost. Similarly, obviously, if we have to cancel a test for any reason in short notice, we will make sure that we reschedule it free of charge. Carl, I just wanted to sort of understand that when you say about refund, because generally quite often someone reschedules their test or we put it on hold for them to move it, we don't refund so that they're already in the system. Obviously, we tend to refund trainer booking type tests, but generally that's not the way it works. But obviously, if people want their money back, they want a refund, they can ask for that.
I think I'm just from a consumer point of view seeking reassurance that there's going to be a clear and well communicated and fair refund policy for those who actually just want to come out of the system and not hold.
Yes, certainly. Yes.
Okay, sorry, Peter. I just thought I'd put that in there because we were talking about.
Mike, you said today there are about 1,200. I think it was Mike that said it. So there are about 1,200 tests being actually used today. Can you tell us how many there would normally be in a normal working day in England?
Off the top of my head, I can't. I didn't have time to find that information, Peter. If you assume that if we were doing, obviously we're not doing 7 tests per day, but if we were doing 7 tests per day, I'd need to establish exactly how many test centres there are in England.
I just wonder.
Probably 15 to 20,000 potentially. I'd need to check that number. Because obviously it will depend upon, they're not all necessarily permanent centres, so they might not be doing 7 tests per day. Depends on how many examiners, etc. So to get a meaningful like with like, we'd probably have to confirm that figure to you.
We can confirm it a bit later, but if we're looking at, if we can confirm it a bit later, if we're looking at 1,600 DEs, which I think is roughly what it is, times 6, it's about 9,600. But I think we'll come back to you with a written confirmation of that to get the actual figure for you.
It just seems a terrible waste of resource to me, you know, at such short notice to introduce tests when people don't really have an opportunity. And I accept that 1,200 have taken that up. I'd be really interested to know how many actually turn up on the day. I know you can't answer that just now, but maybe in the future.
Be interesting to know what the pass rate is as well.
I nearly said that earlier.
We have pass rate curtailments for safety reasons.
I don't like mentioning the word. Yeah, I don't like mentioning the word pass rate when it comes to discussions with you, because it means lots of different things. It's where we try to avoid. So yeah.
Anyway, talking about pass rates and turning up for tests, can you give us any information, or can you give the instructors that are going to be listening to this a bit of information and where we're going to be as far as Part 3 standards checks are concerned?
Yes, of course. But yeah, I think Mike mentioned earlier that obviously all of our warrant card holders, so that is any examiner who is qualified to deliver driving tests, has been asked to spend a certain amount of their time over the next month or so actually delivering a car test to help reduce the backlog. That does include ADI enforcement examiners, but we will continue to prioritise the ADI Part 2 and Part 3, obviously given the time restrictions on the qualification period for potential instructors. And we will also be prioritising certain standards checks, certainly those who were previously substandard, will adopt a risk-based approach, but obviously what that does mean is that some routine standards checks throughout December will be rescheduled, which I'm sure some ADIs will be pleased to hear, some will be disappointed.
I guess a supplementary question. We've had this a couple of times on the help desk this morning. PDIs who are afraid, just like some pupils, that they're just not ready to take their Part 3s and Part 2s right now, and they need more time. Will they be able to move them at the moment on those grounds?
For the Part 3, the requirement, obviously, if their 2-year window is expiring, the requirement is that they actually have a test booked. when their 2-year period expires. Obviously, Jackie has made clear, certainly in terms of trainee licenses, that she will consider COVID circumstances, and I think that obviously happy to take that one away with Jackie.
Okay.
It would depend on where they are in their 2-year
Yeah.
window. Obviously, I think, as you understand, Carly, there was no legal basis on which to extend that window, but obviously we do allow tests beyond that period if we have one booked, so it would be an individual consideration for each instructor as to where they are in their process and within that 2-year period.
All right, thanks, Mark. You on that one?
Yeah, that's me just now, Carla. I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, so my question is on riders and vocational training and testing. Could you just give us a bit of an update on what's happening with motorcycle tests and vocational training? Because they can often feel a little bit ignored in the community. I know you sent communications out tonight, but in discussions, those two groups can sometimes feel a little bit sidelined.
Yeah, obviously we do have discussions with other stakeholders, but I suppose in terms of the numbers and the volumes, and obviously CAR is often at the front of the queue when we come to put comms out first, but obviously it's always quickly followed by communications to vocational and rider. The position here is that rider and vocational training and testing has resumed again today in tiers 1 and tiers 2. They resume in tier 3 tomorrow. I think the key point here is that there's no change to the number of tests being conducted by examiners. So for vocational, for example, examiners will continue to conduct 4 tests per day. They're not going back down to 3, which is what it was obviously when we resumed initially in the summer.
Okay, well, I've asked my next question now, so I'm kicking back to Lynn, I think.
Thanks, Carly. Why have some of your staff at some test centres been able to give information recently to people before it was officially released? The continual issue of regional staff being able to share these comms publicly, whilst as stakeholders we constantly respect and keep to your embargoes, is unfair on members and other test centres and other areas.
I think from me comms, Lynn, obviously, one, I note your point. Certainly, I want to thank NASP for the fact that you do respect our embargoes, that Mike asked you. That's greatly appreciated, and I therefore certainly share your frustration when this sort of thing happens. Obviously, we have 1,600 examiners. They were only briefed yesterday afternoon about obviously the announcement. It's difficult for us to control all of them. So on occasions, we do make clear that national comms will be coming out to NASP, and we probably need to reiterate that a bit more as we move forward to try and avoid this. But I think we all know that there are local relationships out there, but obviously, as always, we try to come to you in advance, but obviously we cannot do that in advance of telling our own staff, because it's important, obviously, the examiners who are going back to work understood first what the position was, rather than them reading it through any other channels. But as I said, yeah, certainly respect the embargo, greatly appreciative of that. And you know that when we have meetings, I'm always very open with what is going on, and perhaps in the future we might just need to consider that a bit more in terms of when we arrange timings of stuff, that if we can share stuff with you slightly sooner, then we'll look to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I listened into one of the local ones on test centre waiting rooms, and it was really well run, and everybody was really respectful of each other.
Yeah.
And I noticed that, but it's just unfair on all the other people who haven't had that. And maybe it would be nice if we could have, for example, those slides, knowing that those people had got them. If we could have had them, we could show everybody.
Yeah, Lynn, I received those this morning. I will be sending them out to you, so you'll have a copy of them. To be clear for everyone watching this call, that session.
What slides?
Well, the slides about waiting room. So it was a waiting room presentation delivered at a local test centre. That's a standardised pack that's been circulated to test centres that are going to open their waiting rooms. It was used and it was discussed. The issue, as Mark quite rightly alluded to, is we need to inform our staff first. It's inappropriate that they receive information from an external source to them rather than coming from us directly. What we do try to do is very carefully sequence things. Now, and I'm very conscious that this is being broadcast, we can't control every single member of our team, every single member of staff. We will do the very best to emphasise that the information needs to come from central comms, but there will be these local relationships at local level, and some inappropriate communications and crossing the line of "you're my mate, I'll share this info with you" isn't acceptable, and we do need to look into it more. In regards to sequencing, we very carefully sequence comms. So we do internal comms first, then we do the stakeholder engagement, as in we send a message to you under embargo. We then do a gov.uk update. We send all the messages out externally through our the external comms, the DVSA directs, your notifies to candidates. Then we release the embargo from yourself, so you can then broadcast that to your members. What we try to do to minimize this risk is to keep that as tight as possible. So if you look at the comms yesterday, the comms were sequenced within all of that, every single bit of that happened within 30 minutes of us pressing a button. So we have a whole Teams call, we're all on a call just like this. I do my bit and then I hand the baton over to somebody else. They do their bit, and it all happens very smoothly. The issue, of course, is yes, we did do webinars with staff at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The reason for that is because they had to be in work today. So yes, those did happen. Clearly, there have been some leaks somewhere. Obviously, Lynn, you've made us aware of some of those. Yeah, we'll take your point as noted.
I think what I'd chip in here is that I respect all of that, and I also get the argument that, you know, it's nice to have local relationships with local test centre managers and examiners, being able to build on those relationships with communications. I just think that there's been quite a few incidences of these that are learning examples now, and that I might not have been liked in many of the organisations that I've had a senior comms role in, but at least we had less leaks because people did know there was a disciplinary risk if people compromised our reputation or our confidentiality by leaking things. I know some people don't do it deliberately. They really think they're helping, but sometimes you're not helping. And NASP realizes that much as our members would say, why don't you just break the embargo and let us know and give us the notice? We actually know that things can change right up to the moment that you're about to clear that comms. Now, some of the individuals yesterday who rushed to online to release what they'd garnered in terms of information just don't have that professional background, and perhaps that the skills to understand that what you might be releasing might become inaccurate information within about 20 seconds of you posting it. So we want to release what is the right information at the right time, rather than the wrong information just because we want to get it out there before anybody else.
Yeah, and again, just to share, you know, what Mark said, you know, again, thank you to NASP for respecting the embargo. You know, for people tuning into this call, it's I sound like a bit of a brown nose now, but it's very difficult for obviously Lynn, Peter, Carly to keep this information to themselves. You know, we do brief under embargo, we do involve in conversations, we try the best we can to involve you in those conversations. So what are we looking to do so you can make a representation of what your members may think and react to? And obviously you've kept that trust and you've kept that relationship for exactly the reason that you pointed out, Carly. The information can change right up to a few minutes before we press send. So again, thank you for that respect.
Well, we don't do it for you. We do it to respect the relationship. But predominantly, you know, speaking for myself and Lynn and Peter, because we've had the discussion, we do it for that very prudent reason that the information can change, and we don't want to mislead people. And I don't think people who don't work in a professional association sense realize that you can cause scares and you can cause inaccurate information to be out there if you don't handle it professionally. So I'm sorry sometimes to our membership, and I'm sure Peter and Lynn would say the same, that it appears we're sitting on things that we should share, but it is done for very valid reasons.
Yeah, and equally, I think there are times when we see things here with people write to us and just assume things, and they'll just say, we're going to do this. They're almost teasing out to us to say, well, actually, that's not right. The correct position is this, to try and get some information. And sometimes that's probably what also is happening out there. I'd imagine some trainers are probably saying, this is what I think may happen on the basis that somebody may respond or put the actual facts out there. But obviously we need to be conscious of that as well, for exactly the same reasons. We want to come to you first. But obviously we get letters most days along those sort of lines saying, can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about, and we have to be very careful what we respond. And obviously, I suppose some lessons learned here is even more so, given that sometimes if we inadvertently have a letter which we would say something that isn't necessarily policy yet or hasn't gone through you, we need to be careful that somebody doesn't pick it up, because social media nowadays is just so easy to spread the answer.
And as we always say to members and other stakeholders, if you've got some information that you've been given that you want to check it, because actually that's being responsible and that's being professional. So rather than run off to shout it from the rooftops, I think I'd probably just check that information first. And there are many channels. They can come to each of the individual associations. They can come to the NASP chair. You don't even necessarily need to go to DVSA, but I would always validate what I'm talking about before I publish it.
Yeah. Sensible.
Moving on to the next. Shall I move on to the next question?
Yes,
Some ADIs want to temperature check examiners before they're allowed to get in their car. Sometimes because they have members of their household, you know, who need to be looked after for various reasons. We understand that's not being allowed. Is that correct?
Firstly, I think probably respect the question. Obviously, I spoke earlier about obviously ongoing discussions with Public Health England. And we will continue to engage with them as we move forward to ensure that our operation procedures remain COVID safe. I must admit, this isn't something that has come up as part of those discussions. Obviously, we have asked them the question, is there anything that we need to be doing coming out of the recent national restrictions differently, or anything that we could do? And obviously that was where the discussion came about the number of tests per day in tier 3. So this hasn't been on their radar. It's not something they have requested. I would like to think that I understand why certain instructors may want to do that. I'd like to think if they explain that to the examiner, that they'd be fairly amenable to it. I think the only thing that may just need checking is depending upon where that assessment is being conducted, whether or not it's being done outside or inside, and whether or not it would affect the reading at all. I'm not saying it would or wouldn't. I think that's just something that occurs to us, but fully understand people obviously have their own risk assessments as part of it. Yes, if they're out working, they're then obviously going home, obviously to family who could be in certain categories CBE, then it's right that they are taking the sensible precautions. But across the board, we've not had those discussions with Public Health England.
No, it's quite new to me as a question as well. It's just something that's come up recently.
Yeah.
Obviously, as advice to people who did want to follow through on that as part of their own risk management, obviously stick to using the kind of temperature gauge thermometers that are hands off and not hands on from a wider
and that was the other point, that in terms of being able to take that, then social distancing is quite difficult. And I suppose that again, I would like to just emphasise and take this opportunity about the importance of both instructors and their pupils wearing face coverings during lessons, because we do still get many incidents of where examiners are saying that they're still seeing pupils turning up at the test centre for their test and putting their face covering on as they arrive.
Okay, obviously it's not all been a bad news, kind of 24, 48 hours. There's been some good news that people are actually allowed to go back to training. But this morning we've also had the other great news, a vaccine is on its way. Will DVSA examiners be a priority for the vaccination programme?
I think you probably know as much as what we do, Carly, on that one. Obviously, I agree with you, very, very good news. Obviously, we'll continue to engage with Public Health England, and that might be something that will be on our agenda. But obviously the arrangements for a national rollout of vaccinations are a bit unknown at this stage. And I think depending on which newspaper you read, you get a different story. I think today it seems to be NHS 1, and obviously those in care homes. I think yesterday it was those in the BAME community. So I think it changes. I think I would rather wait for Public Health England and the government to be able to tell us what the rollout strategy is, and then we will consider sort of whether or not we get involved in that. It was something, not so much vaccinations, but when we were first coming out of the original lockdown back in March, obviously we had discussions with Public Health England about putting all candidates through a COVID test. Obviously we need to think about the practicalities of all of that and how it would work, but obviously it's something that will certainly be on our agenda as the details come available about the vaccinations.
Yeah, because obviously testing has actually got more rapid, hasn't it, as we've learned and been able to develop, the technology and the tests over lockdown. So it could be a possibility that there is some level of testing in the future.
I think the challenges there would be operationally how we would deliver it, because ideally you'd probably want to be having the test fairly soon before the driving test, and obviously does that mean taking it on site? Who takes it? What would we do with the result, etc. And again, I suppose I'm conscious that's a last minute decision around a test when a candidate is potentially already nervous, and obviously won't it go ahead? I suppose a little bit like track when you decide personal choice whether or not you travel abroad. I suppose you put yourself at that risk and probably
you
pay
have to take the
slightly
financial
more.
burden, and the actual burden to get. And if people do, you know, I suppose we have to go back to the fact that nobody's putting a gun to the head of the candidate coming for a test. It's their choice to be able to take a driving test or not. So whether it becomes consumer responsibility to have the COVID test themselves.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. If we did, in the scenario that there was frontline vaccination of driving examiners, how would you handle things like refusals, people who just refuse to be vaccinated amongst your driving examiner workforce?
I don't think we've necessarily got the answer to that, Carly, given we haven't had those discussions with Public Health England. I think it's something obviously that we would have to take away internally to understand what that means. And the same would also apply obviously if it came to regular COVID tests for our staff. I think it's and obviously the other thing we need to think about, if we went down that route for testing, for example, if it meant our examiners were going off to get tested, when did they do that? What we wouldn't want to do is obviously cancel tests to send them off to be able to go and have those done. But obviously that's still discussion. There's some negotiations that would need to take place. But I think the key thing here is that Public Health England, we haven't opened those discussions. We would have those discussions with them, who would obviously help us come up with a solution if they were deemed by Public Health England to be appropriate for us.
I recognise.
I think we're quite some way off that.
Yeah,
I think we're quite some way off that.
I think it's triggered by the fact that already we've got a spate of people on social media who are saying, as citizens, they don't like the idea of vaccination, they won't do it. And I think it's an interesting employer and employee question and about civil rights, about whether you take it. So I think we just wanted to have an idea that you're actually thinking about these things.
They're talking about incentivising people by giving them shopping vouchers. As long as they're not for Debenhams, then that's fine.
They'll be all Peter, you wanted a question, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, just talking about incentives, could I turn the tables back just a few minutes? When you were good enough to talk about the slides for waiting rooms, would either of you two gentlemen have any good news about waiting rooms for the future?
There'll be an announcement coming out within the next hour.
Oh,
there you go.
Very pleased about that, Mike, aren't you? There's no smugness in that response in any way.
No, there really wasn't. So yeah, we do have an announcement lined up. It's loaded up and ready to go out shortly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's covering England, Scotland, and Wales.
Yeah. You realise we'll take the credit for that.
Yeah.
Our next question.
Well, you should. I mean, you were involved, and you should. I mean, you have raised those issues. You have pointed out, I've worked with us in clarifying what would be an acceptable compromise in terms of getting the balance right between the operational issues of us maximising the availability of driving examiners, making sure they're safe in the workplace, make sure they've got workspace. We can't open all waiting rooms, as I've said on all of your individual webinars, for operational reasons, but we have worked with you to identify, what is an acceptable compromise. We've done a site assessment on every single site, which was at your suggestion, and obviously we worked with you on that. We're in the process of changing fire doors to make them two-way, so enable one-way traffic. We're doing quite a lot to make these test centre waiting rooms available, because again, winter is coming, and we do respect that. So it has been a collaborative effort with you, both in terms of you representing your members, us highlighting what is and what is not possible, and finding a compromise solution. But yeah, I think you'll like the announcement that's coming out in an hour or so.
Great, it's a good news day.
No pressure.
Yeah,
one other question from me, and I'll get accused of being patriotic towards this one, but you know full well that we have real difficulties with obtaining theory tests in Scotland. Is there any way forward with discussing with Pearson expanding the opening time for tests? Instead of just a 3-month wait, could it be up to 4 or 5 months? Because pupils, if they can't book tests, they just don't want to learn to drive, and that affects the business of a driving instructor really badly. Now, I know it affects all across the country. In Scotland, because of the 2-metre waiting social distancing, it's much more difficult. But couldn't we just open more slots to allow people to at least book?
We've already done that, Peter. I think the issue for us at this point is we've maximised our capacity. We're at the max as where we are at this point. You're quite right in terms of what you pointed out, that you're still operating at the 2 metre social distancing. Obviously, we're very respectful of devolved government's right and authority to make those decisions. It's as they'll analyse the public health information available to them, and they will advise us on what is and what is not permissible. In terms of where we're at the moment, we really can't do much more. We are maxed out. So we've opened additional days already around the Glasgow area, Clydebank, Greenock. We've extended the opening hours and closing times where we can. Again, a lot of those sites are leased, so we can't necessarily open them any further than we have. So in terms of what Pearson have done, that they've maxed capacity through opening additional hours, opening additional days. But until that 2 metre social distancing rule is lowered, we're going to struggle. And again, our mobile testing vehicles, they're out of action at the moment because again, we're not able to socially distance using them. So it's had a massive impact on our capacity and capability, and we can't do anything more than what we've already done.
So the least we can do is assure all of our members jointly that you're doing the best you can.
Every sinew's been stretched. As I say, we've opened the maximum hours that we can. We've opened additional days until that 2 metre rule is rescinded, and we can obviously it'll basically double our capacity. Then we can't really do much more.
Thank you. I think Carly has another question or two she wants to.
It's yours, Peter. So you might as well ask the last one there.
Okay, then. So what strategies have DVSA got in place at the moment for catching up on the huge backlog of driving tests across the country?
I've already mentioned today, obviously, the tests that were made available today, and I've obviously also spoken about all warrant card holders spending some of their time conducting car tests, including ADI examiners. I think beyond that, we've been operating for quite a while now, schemes for our examiners, either overtime schemes or have been offering to buy back unused annual leave, because obviously in the current climate, some people haven't maybe had planned holidays but weren't able to use them. I think obviously going forward, they will continue. Overtime has been made available to examiners. I think there's probably a nuance here that obviously in tiers 1 and 2, we're able to offer weekday and weekend overtime. But obviously in tier 3, given we've reduced the number of tests being conducted by examiners, we can offer weekend overtime, but we're not offering weekday on the basis that we reduced it for 5 for a reason. So therefore, to obviously increase testing through overtime is not feasible in those areas.
Do the same conditions apply across the vocational side?
Yes, it will be the same. The overtime availability is available to all examiners. It would also extend to motorcycling as well.
Lovely, thank you. I'll hand it back to you, Carla.
I think the advice that we obviously give to our wider membership there is, although it's extremely frustrating, we know and we hear you that in some instances, because of the backlog, new tests might not be able to be acquired until into spring 2021. But there is a truth in the advice that if you keep checking the system as slots are released, as cancellations mean slots are released, it could be that you do pick up another slot. So what I would say is be prepared as a service provider yourself, as a trainer, to be going and checking that system to find those new slots. And yes, it might mean you doing that on a daily basis, but if that's what your customer wants and needs, then those are the things that we have to do to satisfy our customers. I suppose the other advice is, as we've had in other lockdowns, is not lockdowns, but in other times where there's been peak demand, you may have to travel to an alternative test centre. That is obviously fraught, given that we're trying to discourage too much travel into region if we can. But there are options to try and get tests sooner, not huge amounts of slots, but they do exist. And I would encourage people to be vigilant and keep checking the system rather than taking a default position of, oh, it's all rubbish, I can't get anything till next spring. You might find you're surprised and you can get some slots when you need them.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful advice, Carly, because I think Gareth, obviously we started with the Transport Select Committee, we can end with that as well, because I think Gareth, when he spoke to them, he did mention, I think there was a candidate who passed their theory test one day and the practical test the next over the last couple of months, and that was very much on having done that. They were prepared to travel for their practical test, did so, obviously got a short-term availability, went along to a test centre they didn't really know, but obviously passed their test, which is obviously good news. Obviously I had good practice, good trainer to enable them just to turn up at that test centre, having never been there before, obviously passed. So obviously it does work.
Yeah, and the moment they leave the test centre with a licence, the inevitability is a lot of newly licensed pupils are going to drive to areas they've never been to before because they have that licence. So
yes,
there is a mythology that people shouldn't be asked to go to a different test centre because they're not ready for it. They're ready to be licensed to drive independently. Both the trainer and the pupil need to be prepared in some instances to achieve that earlier test by making the move to other areas as well. Well, thank you very much for your openness and honesty this morning, both. The jury is now going to consider your defence, and
yeah,
we'll take into consideration the mitigating circumstances that you've given us today, and we'll pass judgment shortly.
Okay, I'll look out for the knock on the door. I might not answer.
Yeah, we have our own enforcement team these days. Well, yeah, thank you again. Thanks to Lynn.
No, you're welcome. No, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
As well for sharing with us their members' concerns and questions as well. And to all of our members, thank you for your patience with us as well, and your understanding during this very difficult period. I think I speak on behalf of all associations here that we are aware of the issues, and we're aware that it's been a really difficult time for everybody. So we do empathise, but thank people actually for being still polite with us on our help desks and in the question that they've asked us. We'll continue to produce as NASP a set of FAQs. So there's questions you think we didn't answer today. Well, therefore, send them into our various help desks, and we'll add them to the list that Paul or Mike has to wade through and find answers on a daily basis. And so we'll keep updating and sending out to you as situations develop. But to everybody watching today, hopefully you're back on the road or back into the mode of running your business now. And good luck going back out there. Hope you can remain out there for as long as is safely possible for you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thank you.